Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's session. My name is Phil Lanier, and I'll be your host for today's session. I want to thank you all very much for joining a discussion on managing conflict in teams with Marilyn Laiken. This event is brought to you by Coaching Ourselves. In today's hybrid workplace, people are reporting record numbers of disconnection. In fact, 65% of employees feel they lack the space at work to have meaningful conversations. Coaching Ourselves peer learning, combined with expert content from top thought leaders like Linda Hill, Edgar Schein, and of course, Marilyn Laiken. With Coaching Ourselves, leadership development professionals can deliver peer learning programs to prepare their leaders for management, keep their people connected, and provide the space so employees can support and help one another develop and grow. Marilyn Laiken has prepared a Coaching Ourselves peer learning discussion guide on managing conflict in teams that you can use with your leaders to help them learn about and get better at managing conflict in teams. So don't let your organization fall behind. In the ever-changing workplace, visit coachingourselves.com and learn how we can help your people thrive with peer learning and expert content. And now on to Marilyn Laiken and managing conflict in teams. So Marilyn, I want to thank you so very much for being here today. And I'd like to start by asking you to share a little bit about your journey. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your career.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be talking about conflict in teams, even though that may not sound like such a wonderful, pleasant topic. It's always exciting for me, and I'll tell you about that later. I am semi-retired after working in the field of OD and change since 1974 as a consultant. And in 1980, I joined the University of Toronto as a professor of workplace learning and change. And I worked there for 20 years. And then I left there to start two programs through the Schulich School of Business at York University in organization development and change and training and development. So I've just recently pulled back from all of that, though I'm still very happily continuing to write modules for Coaching Ourselves. Hope that goes on for a long time. And I'm now living in Fredericton, about a block from my beloved grandchildren, and enjoying life here on the East Coast.
Thank you, and thank you for making the time for us today. So let's get right into it. And I'd like to ask you, what are some of the common sources of conflict within teams, and how can HR professionals identify them?
Okay, so I'd like to start by saying that I assume that in any relationship, there's going to be conflict, whether it's a couple relationship, a child-parent or a child-child even, or in teams in the workplace. There will be conflict, because if there's no conflict, there's no relationship. Because there's always differences. And especially in a team, you're working across many kinds of differences, differences in values and cultural differences, linguistic differences, especially now with virtual teams, there's a lot of that, skill differences. And if you don't surface the issues that come from those differences colliding with each other, then you're not going to be able to move ahead as a team. So you can assume that there's conflict, and then, okay, so what do we do with it? One of the causes of conflict is, in a team especially, is I call non-productive member behavior, where people are acting out. I mean, it might be something as simple as rolling your eyes when somebody speaks, or tapping your pen impatiently, that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be big stuff, but those things are annoying, and they get in the way of being able to work productively. So confronting that rather than just ignoring it helps with dealing with conflict. Teams have to manage workload distribution, inequities in the workload, inequities in people's commitment to the work. They need to, these days, teams are more and more being asked to evaluate their own performance. And that, of course, raises conflict, because people are scared and threatened and so on, and don't know much about giving and receiving feedback. So that makes it difficult. And then finally, the most important one, I think, is, excuse me, one of the causes of conflict in a team is needing to confront the leader, if there's a designated leader, and especially if it's a manager, because they're usually higher in the hierarchy than the rest of the team. If the team does not push against the leadership, they will never develop as an effective team. So at some point in the team's process, there's a storming phase, usually about midway through the life of the team, if they have a designated amount of time together. And the team needs to pull back from wanting to hold on to control and let the team start to take over its own work. And if the leader resists that, which most leaders do for all kinds of reasons, the team will stay dependent on the leader or go underground with their gripes. So those are some of the common, there are many causes, but those are some of the common causes of team conflict. Oh, one other cause, which is a big one, is people making assumptions about what other people think and not checking them through. And so they go into a kind of a cycle of making an assumption, acting on that assumption, getting a reaction from what you're doing, and it just goes a downward spiral. I call it an attribution cycle.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of things that you did mention, Marilyn, and there's one I hadn't heard from you before, but it makes a lot of sense. You started right at the beginning to say, people don't realize, but if there's no conflict, there's no relationship. And that for me is, I remember myself, especially when I was younger and I was a very shy and introverted software developer. And for me, I thought that if there's a conflict, there's no relationship. In other words, conflict is the opposite of relationship. And you've just pointed out quite obviously that conflict is part of a relationship. It's not the opposite.
And critical, I would say, to a relationship. But Phil, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's been all kinds of research done on this, that the reaction to conflict is usually negative. If you hear the word conflict, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
I want to run away. I want to avoid conflict. Do something to make it better so the other person doesn't feel like that there's a conflict. And I get a visceral physical reaction. It's not just me cognitively saying, I don't want this to happen, but my whole body reacts in this sort of tension that says, I have to stop this conflict. I have to get away. I have to make it go away. So yes, it's burnt into my brain at some point, I would say.
And you're really not alone. I think most of and across the world, not just in our culture, but everywhere, that is people's reaction to conflict. And so they avoid it. So why do they avoid it? Why do you feel that way, about it? Why do people have a negative reaction to conflict? There are lots of reasons. One of them is there aren't very good role models for conflict management. And just let me say that I don't talk about conflict resolution. I talk about conflict management, because not all conflicts are resolvable. So we'll talk about that more later. But I really think it's important to realize that we haven't had good role models. I mean, in my own family, my parents would not fight in front of us. They would go to their bedroom and close the door. We could hear them. We knew they were fighting, but they didn't want to let us see them fight. Well, why not? Why not? Why not do that in front of the kids in a way that's positive and works out? And of course, the fear is it's not going to be positive. It's not going to work out. And we're just going to give the kids a scare if we fight in front of them, right? So that's kind of that goes on. We're told, don't fight, be nice, especially women in our culture are told, don't fight, be nice. And so we tend to envision conflict as a win-lose situation, and we'll probably lose if we get into one. We're just as likely to lose as a win, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
So we avoid conflict, we withdraw from it, we postpone it, we don't deal with it, we accommodate others to eliminate it, we're polite, okay, we'll go along, but in the end, we're not servicing our real feelings, and so they will come back in another way.
And as you had mentioned, I believe earlier, this is especially true in the workplace, in the sense that we all have, or at least I certainly had when I was younger, entering the workplace for the first time in my life. conflict was a very negative thing to engage in the workplace, and should be tamped down, should be solved, should be, and as you mentioned, that leads to a number of issues.
Exactly. And if you read the research on the learning organizations, Senge's research from way back, and current research, it talks about the importance of organizations to surface the conflicts and not avoid them, and not make people avoid conflicts. Like if we make a mistake, let's use that as an opportunity for learning. Let's not just say, oh, that was a mistake. We'll either blame somebody for it or we'll forgive them, right? Let's learn from it. What happened there? Let's talk about it. Why did that happen? That is really the bottom line of a learning organization. So
very much. And in terms of the barriers, just to continue with that, are there any other barriers to confronting conflict in the workplace that you could share with us?
Well, you just mentioned one of them. It's not a cultural norm for people to deal with conflict directly, especially if it's confronting someone higher in the hierarchy. And often that's the kind of thing that needs to be done. A manager is saying, let's really respect families in this organization. They might even have a value statement that says we're a family-oriented organization. And then they organize meetings at night in the evening so that people can't be with their families. Well, if that doesn't get talked about, there's a real gap between the walk and the talk. And it's important for organizations to surface those issues and talk about them, whether they're with managers or with people, with each other. Because what happens is if you don't do that, there's ongoing resentment and unexpressed anger, and it always surfaces somehow. It comes out, the kick the dog syndrome, right?
Mm-hmm.
The boss kicked me, so I go home and kick the dog. Right? The dog deserved to be kicked. The boss deserved to be kicked, or at least dealt with, not kicked. But nobody talks about that, so they never get resolved. And when conflicts don't get resolved, they don't go away. It's like an infection that doesn't get treated. It keeps recycling, coming back, but it comes back in passive aggressive ways. And people, will shoot zingers in a meeting at each other. I was in a meeting once that I was so appalled. I couldn't believe what was happening. The communication was constant, throwing zingers at each other. It was like a norm of how they worked together. And that would have been okay if it had been a productive group, but it wasn't. I mean, people were dodging zingers more than engaging in creative thinking with each other, So that kind of thing. And of course, we talked about the storming phase. So one of the biggest barriers and one of the results of conflict avoidance is avoiding the storming phase, not dealing with issues when they come up, which blocks performance in a team. Very
much. And I have personal examples where I'll be in a team and talking about, some of my team members, I know they may disagree with something that I've just said, but they're not saying it. And exactly. I'd like them to say it. And I know that they're not saying it because they want to avoid conflict. Because if I was in their shoes, frankly, I likely would have gone through that same thought process in my head. And so I'm there as a team leader, and I'm trying my best to get these things to come out so that we can talk about it. And it's very, very challenging. And frankly, sometimes I just don't know what to do. And I'm frustrated because I know that we could get ourselves into a better state if we could somehow talk about these things. But of course, they have to happen naturally. And so you just
but they don't happen naturally. That's the thing. No. They don't. So you need to deal with it. You need to say, I noticed you had a reaction. For instance, let's say somebody's in the meeting talking, presenting an idea, and somebody else is sitting there rolling their eyes and tapping their hand. You know that they're having a reaction to the person, right? So you or anyone else in the team or the person who's talking could turn to the person who's reacting non-verbally and say, I noticed you had a reaction to what I just said. Could you tell me what that is? So it is a confrontation, but it's an invitational confrontation. You're trying to find out more about what's going on. Anybody can do that. So you as a manager can say, I just have a feeling that there's something going on here and I'm not hearing the whole story. Can anybody tell me what that is? Open it up, open it up, and give people permission to say what's on their mind. And then when they do, don't close it down. So if they turn to you and say, as the manager, well, actually, the problem is you, which could happen if you open it up. And that's the fear, and that's why people don't do it. So what's the next thing you say? Actually, Phil, the problem is you, not very specific feedback. So what do you say to the person?
I would ask them to tell me more, or I would use some sort of a phrase that doesn't shut down anything and leaves it wide open. And of course, what I would probably try to do, but maybe likely fail, is not insinuate things. And that's where I tend to have to be careful because of you just talk sometimes.
Yeah, not assume anything. So first sentence, tell me more, is perfect. Perfect. Tell me more. What do you mean I'm the problem? Tell me more about that. And then as people start to give you the information, you don't shut them down. You don't get defensive. Even if you don't agree, you listen and you try to understand what they're saying. And you might turn to other people in the group and say, do other people feel this way? And, you know, as you open that up and ask that question, people will start to come forward with their real feelings. Actually, you know, you're managing, you're over managing the group, you're hovering, you're giving us too much. We need more freedom, more space, more to be creative. So you listen and you say, okay, how can I do that effectively? And you know, then you enter that conversation, you surface the issues. That's the hardest part because people won't deal with the issues. They're scared. If you manage to surface the issues, then you can get into a problem-solving stance. So what can we do about that? We want to be the best possible team we are. How can we move ahead with that? That takes some, yeah.
It certainly does. There's the thing that you said that I, as a leader, and I suspect other leaders go through the same process, is there's a time when in our heads, we'll say like what you just suggested we vocalize, which is, I know something's not going right here, and I see your body language. Could you share what you're thinking? I'm curious to know. But I've tended, as perhaps many of my colleagues, other leaders, just to keep that inside and then try to do some other way to like have it come out where we could just say exactly what's going through our head in a diplomatic way. And that's a very good tip. Yeah.
And if you do that, then you are modeling the behavior for other people. So that's so critical because especially if you're the manager or the leader of the team, if you can do it, oh, maybe I could do it, right? So modeling the behavior, walking your talk, being able to acknowledge the importance of surfacing conflict in a team and then dealing with it is such an important thing, probably the most important thing to teach a team.
Yeah. And I was just looking at one of the comments here. We had Sylvie who talked about this idea of the safe space. And, we frequently talk about this idea of creating a safe space, but you create a safe space by doing just that, by having one of these sort of things that's going on in your head and you just open it up and you articulate it to the team. It might seem risky, but then all of a sudden, if everyone accepts it, you're in a safe space. You're in a different level of trust in the discussion and you can move things forward.
And that takes people through the storming phase into high performing. That's exactly what does it.
Right. Yeah. So tell me more about some of these common approaches to managing conflict within teams. And this, of course, was one of the approaches, which is as a leader, if you have something in your head that you're maybe thinking of keeping to yourself, don't share it and open things up.
And teach other people in the team to do that and make it possible for them to do that. So if they're scared of doing it face-to-face, do a roses and thorns. So you initiate that conversation without people having to own their own concern. And then eventually teams get better at doing it face-to-face. And they don't need the anonymity, but helping the team to do that anonymously or face-to-face is the best thing you can do. And then, of course, when you get confronted, which you will, if the team is healthy and is going to be healthy, they will eventually confront you as the leader in some way, throwing the leader out, we used to call it. And it can be figuratively. I've been physically thrown out of groups.
Oh my.
I've been thrown out so many times, I can't even begin to list the ways, but getting thrown out is an achievement as a leader, because it's like a parent letting go of the kids. A teenage kid will rebel because they want to throw the parent out, figuratively, and become their own person. And the team goes through the same kind of development phase in throwing out the leader. So the leader letting go of control, really letting the team take over and become interdependent with each other and independent of you, is what you want in the end, because then they own the work, they become proud of what they're doing, they take responsibility like a grown-up who has been a child who had to separate from the parents, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing team leaders can do. Excuse me, team leaders, of course, helping a team reflect on their process is an important part of it. So how did we do as a team? What could we do better next time? How will we change what we did today to be even more effective? And if necessary, being I call it a third-party mediator as a team leader. So two people in the team are fighting for something, for some reason, and you don't think it's a team issue. You can take it offline and you can referee their conversation, make sure that the communication is clear and that they're problem solving together until they reach some solution. And then you may want to bring those results back to the team. I would let the people do it. So they know that the issue has been resolved and they're not kept in the dark. But you don't have to have them online for that whole thing, right?
Right.
So that's I'm just checking some notes to see what team members can do to help. Is first of all, learn to expect and value conflict as a normal part of human interaction. So creating that safe space you were talking about, helping people realize differences are not defects, that we can deal with differences. And if we can't deal with the differences, we can work around them so we can manage a polarity, right? People need to learn, and this is emotional intelligence, people need to learn to understand and own their own contribution to the problem. So you can model that as a leader too. Gee, I did something yesterday that I didn't think helped the team, and I want to apologize for that. And here's what I did, and I'm going to do something differently next time. So owning the problem, helping people own the problem themselves, not getting trapped in making assumptions, and no blaming, no, it's your fault. Let's just talk about what happened and how we can do it differently next time. So you can create that environment, and eventually the team will pick up on that. And of course, developing and practicing conflict management skills, all the skills we've been talking about. One of the key skills, which people tend not to do, and you mentioned it before, is suspending resolution of problems. So right away, when there's a problem, people will want to jump in and say, oh, we can do this, we can do that. But you could stop the action, or anybody in the group can stop the action and say, let's see if we can make sure we understand what the problem is before we start solving it. It might be a polarity to manage, not a problem to solve. So doing that, testing assumptions, listening, active listening to each other, teaching people how to give and receive feedback and listen actively, how to acknowledge their own feelings, how to express their needs. People can't do that very well. Here's what I need in this group, and put it out there, and for others to really listen and think about that. And then problem solving creatively, brainstorming and so on towards win-win solutions when you know what the problem is. The problem to solve is not the big issue in conflict. The difficult part of conflict management is surfacing the issues, finding out what they are. Once you know what they are, it's not hard to, people are very good at creatively solving problems. They know what they are and they've heard about them.
Thank you for sharing that. That was very, very insightful, especially for me, being introverted, being extra difficult to get anything sometimes that involves, non-operational discussions. But I do want to highlight some of the takeaways that I'm getting as I'm listening to you that I've never done. We have, after some of our meetings and our processes, we do have a kind of a debrief where we talk about the process of this meeting and should we keep having whatever, a weekly status meeting or whatever it is we're doing. But I've never once had the discussion, and I feel like I've wanted to. Has there been any conflict that's unresolved or unsurfaced during this discussion? And if we can do that at the end of the discussion as part of that kind of process debrief, I might get lucky and I might get some nuggets of conflict to get out there. And then, of course, as you said, once they're out there, then we can at least start to hash it out and do have some movement. Very interesting.
Just a word of advice, don't use the word conflict because you know how conflict raises people's hackles.
Right.
So a way to ask the question would be, what's getting in the way of us effectively working as a group?
Yeah.
And the conflicts will surface if you ask that question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I want to go, thank you very much, everybody who's putting these questions in the comments, Ilias and Carolyn and Ron and all of you. I see all of this and this is marvelous. I'm going to try to get to 2 or 3 of them. And your points are wonderful. I just want to highlight, I was just looking at, Ilias was mentioning earlier, a manager needs a lot of discipline to resist engaging in the responsibility of the whole team to navigate its dynamics. And I want to underline that, Ilias, and thank you for highlighting that. I admit that I have in the past and likely in the future will not have as much discipline as required because I tend to want to make everything work and fix everything. And I know that's a mistake. And so thank you for highlighting that very much.
Very important.
So there's a question from one of our colleagues, Ron. Do we need to manage conflict differently with the reality of hybrid virtual teams of today?
Such a good question. I think the basic skills are all the same. There are some differences in managing virtual teams. And people disagree on this. There's some argument about this, but some people believe that virtual teams allow people more anonymity, more room to kind of hide or not be as present, which may inhibit the surfacing of conflict. So you might have to be more determined to have the team surface issues. You still see people, so you can pay attention to nonverbal feedback, but it's not as evident. You don't see the whole body. You don't see the body language. You don't necessarily see people sitting with their arms crossed or things that would indicate to you that someone's not in agreement with what's going on. So again, you just need to be more attentive to what's going on. But all of the skills we talked about are the same skills that people would need to use in virtual teams, probably more so. because they're virtual. So
Right.
yeah.
You know, there's one thing in our own experience here at Coaching Ourselves, we're a small team, and obviously during the COVID, we were 100% virtual, and now we've started to, let's say, trickle back into a kind of a hybrid. And certainly, you know, we're at a minimum 1 day a week where we get together all in person, and that has helped with this kind of moving these things forward in terms of the conflict management, resolution, discussion. However, it's certainly has been helpful in that, and that perhaps is not always as obvious until you start to experience the mix when you're in the real world, as it were, to surface conflict. So that's been interesting.
Well, I have a colleague who has written a lot of books on teams, and he talks about travel for trust, that being face to face sometimes creates that safe space, so that if you go back to the virtual environment, there's more trust. It's a safer space. Yeah.
There's an interesting and difficult question from Carolyn on the chat here. If a conflict is not resolved, what approaches can managers use to manage forward or to move things forward?
A good question. Let me think about that. See, I believe that conflicts are resolvable. So if it's not being resolved, it's probably that we don't have the whole story yet. We don't have the whole picture. If it surfaces that the conflict is a polarity to manage, it's not resolvable, it's not going to be resolved, then I would put to the team, okay, we have these 2 points of view. We're never going to bring them together. How do we work effectively around them? How do we agree to disagree? But it's not enough just to say, okay, we agree to disagree, which is what people do sometimes. That's an avoidant thing. But how are we going to agree to disagree? How are we going to work together and not let this difference get in the way? And that becomes the problem to solve.
Yeah.
So you don't give up, because problems are resolvable. They're manageable, whether it's a polarity management issue or a problem to brainstorm and be creative about.
And I know we'd had this discussion. I'll just share with everybody. When I was a young manager, we were still writing a lot of software code by hand, let's say, and there was massive, almost religious debates about the styles of comments that we had to put in our code. And this was a polarity with 2 members of my team who were both really hotshot software developers, but had these sort of vicious differences over this kind of inane thing. In essence, you could choose one or the other, was our perspective. But like you said, it was turning into a personal battle. And we had to get the personal out of it and talk about, you know, this issue separate from the people. And it was only then that we started to move things forward, but it was challenging.
So you were able to do that?
We were, but I have to say, in retrospect, that could have been more efficient, because, of course, as is wont, I tried to run away from the conflict at first and do things like, oh, well, why don't you two just solve it? You know, which is me neglecting my responsibility as a manager to deal with something that I didn't really want to deal with. But in the end, I think somebody else in the discussion here talked about having a what did the person say here? I think it was Ilias who mentioned something about a sort of not a special friend, but a critical friend. And so that can be very helpful for a leader, to have somebody who can be their support person in, you know, negotiating perhaps the personal issues that might erupt from conflict over style of, you know, comments in code, for example.
Right. And many of the people watching are HR folks, right?
Yes.
They could offer their skills as conflict mediators to maybe 2 people in a team who are having a conflict. As I talked about before, third-party mediation, they have those skills. They should have those skills, and they can work with a pair. You know, we're over time. You don't have time for
I know.
No. Okay.
No, tell us one more. Give us another anecdote. We'll
This is
go
just
for it.
a quick anecdote. When I was a professor at U of T, I became chair for the last 4 years. And the first thing I encountered as chair were two key staff members who were not talking to each other. They were in a battle. And I had no idea what it was or what caused it, but I knew we couldn't proceed as a department with these two key managers not talking to each other. So I pulled them into my office and I told them what I was going to do. I was going to mediate the conflict. I was going to talk with both of them and have them talk to each other. And I started by saying, what do you appreciate about each other? And they were able to do that, fortunately. Then I said, okay, now what's getting in the way? Why are you not talking to each other? And they started to talk to me about and to each other about what was going on. It turned out that the whole problem was a systemic problem that the former chair had caused by putting one of the managers superior to the other, although they played the same role in the union. They were in the same role and being paid the same salary, but she won the supervisor of the other. And this had caused terrible resentment from the person who was being supervised. And she pushed against the other one who got resentful, like, I'm just trying to do my job. And, it was all about this whole, so we just eliminated that and said, okay, we're going back to you're equal in this staff. Now let's talk about how you can work together. And they ended the meeting hugging each other. That's not always the outcome, and not during COVID for sure. But it's like that. You just have to surface the issues, find out there's always a cause for the problem. There's always a reason. People don't like to be in conflict, not comfortable. It's not a nice place to be. Find out what's going on. Be a detective.
Wonderful note to end on. There was one question that we had coming from Ilias just now. Is there any book or video or movie that's influenced Marilyn in her becoming wiser in managing conflict in teams? Anything you could share for people to dig deeper into some of this?
Thomas Kilman, Kilman, has a conflict mode questionnaire that helps people look at their conflict management style. And that's been very helpful to me. There's tons of stuff, if you look it up on the web, on managing conflict in teams. And I'm trying to think, I've been doing this for so long. What were my initial influences? I'm trying to remember. Nothing's jumping right now, but Thomas Kilman has been very important.
Thomas Kilman. I'm just going to write that name into the chat. Kilman.
And he's written stuff. Well, there's all the books we know about on team management talk about conflict. They all do. So they're all useful. The group development theory, which goes way back to 1940s, has been incredibly helpful in helping me understand the storming phase. And Bruce Tuckman, Tuckman, talks about this theory, and he uses forming, norming, performing. That's his terminology, but there are different terminologies depending on that's the easiest one to remember. And knowing that theory has been very important to me in understanding conflict in teams, because it, talks about the storming phase.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. I managed to type a couple of those into the chat so folks can look those up. And of course, I want to mention to everybody, of course, we have the peer learning discussion guide on managing conflict in teams. That is a great tool that you can use with groups of leaders in your organization to have a 90-minute peer learning session around these various aspects of why we have conflict, why do we avoid, and some tools and techniques that the managers can practice during these peer learning sessions to try to resolve conflict and get better at managing the conflict in their teams on an ongoing basis. So I want to invite everybody to check out CoachingOurselves.com, and you can find Marilyn's peer learning discussion guide along with all these others that you can use with your leadership development programs. Of course, there's some things that you can follow up on that we've put in the chat. And we have a number of different topics from Marilyn, not just conflict in teams. So please check everything out. And thank you so much, Marilyn, for your time and for supporting us and for being there. And thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
I so enjoyed this. I wish I could have heard from the folks, but glad that they put their stuff in the chat. So thank you very much for your questions and comments, and good luck with managing conflict.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Be well, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.